And he starts describing what his father had told him, which very closely matched the description from the apparition through a net. So that kind of experience, I don't even, what do you make of that?
Welcome to What the Fuck Just Happened. I'm your host, Liz Enton. If you listen to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I will be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird shit. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the fuck just happened? In this episode, Darren McEnany of Seeking Eye and I continue our conversation with parapsychologist Loyd Auerbach. If you missed the last episode, episode 13, you might be kind of confused because we jump right into where we left off. So you might want to go back and listen.
And I asked him why why is all this happening to me right now? And he said, just to prove to you that it's real.
I feel like I had a little bit of similar, it was having a few personal experiences, which I very rarely have, but that really made me able to listen to mediums and believe them when they'd say, oh, it feels like this, or it's like this, before I was like, right.
That sort of experience also contains kind of the valuable information that I look for in out-of-body experiences, which is the veridical aspect to it. You had the notes that you could compare. Whereas a lot of out-of-body experiences that are mainly subjective, you don't have that ability to prove that they actually happen the way that you experience them to be. But with yours, it seems that you have that collaboration that you could compare and find identical notes with.
Yeah, and I've been fortunate to have corroborative or vertical experiences of my own, but even the people that I work with, some of the cases I've got, having situations where you have multiple witnesses, a consistent pattern to what's actually going on, consistent information. We had one of the sessions we do with a psychic by the name of Annette Martin, who was my investigation partner for a long time until she passed away in 2011. We did a lot of work at a restaurant called the Moss Beach Distillery, which I'm still involved with. I've been working with in kind of a long-term investigation since 91. And in 1999, we had 98, 99, we had a couple of press parties there, and we did a seance kind of thing. And at one of the sessions where the reporters were asking the ghost questions through Annette, and on occasion, Annette went into trance and the apparition would speak through her. But there was one thing that someone asked. This is an old Prohibition era building. So it was built in the 1920s. It was a speakeasy for quite some time, although not the kind where you needed a secret password. It was here on the California coast. And from what we had heard from the local historian and from old time, when I first started doing this, I started talking to some old timers who have since passed away themselves, who grew up in the area and knew they went to the place when they were kids or when they were adults back then. And they, I was always interested to see if there was any G-men raids, any government raids on the place. It was thought that, and there was pretty good evidence that the beach below was one of the coves where smugglers brought up booze from Canada. And of course it was supplied to the restaurant, then taken into San Francisco. We had no idea that there were ever any raids. And that made sense because according to the stories from the old timers, people who went to the restaurant, to the speakeasy, included the mayors of San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and other towns, police chiefs from the Bay Area, the governor of California, and people from Hollywood who were up in the Bay Area. would go drink there because they didn't believe in prohibition. So nobody's going to raid that if the governor of California is there, right? That would not look good. It turns out, according to the apparition, to the blue lady, to Kate, that there were 3 raids on the beach observed by people in the restaurant, and the description came through. Right. So several months later, I was interviewing a witness at the USS Hornet Aircraft Carrier Museum, one of our other longer term cases, who's a former Navy SEAL and had had a number of experiences on the Hornet, although he refused to call them ghost experiences. He said, here's what happened. He said, I don't know if I believe in ghosts or not, but here's what I experienced. So then he tells us that he had had an experience at the distillery back in the 50s. He saw the blue lady, which from a guy who doesn't believe in ghosts is pretty interesting. And the reason he was even there in the 1950s is because his father was an attorney for the state of California. And he proceeds to tell us about stories about his father getting to know the owner of the restaurant, the original owner, Frank Torres, and then subsequent owners, because he met them when he was there on the 3 raids on the Smuggler's Beach below the restaurant that happened during Prohibition. And he starts describing what his father had told him, which very closely matched the description from the apparition through a net. So that kind of experience, I don't even, what do you make of that? It's not written down anywhere, and there's no records of this. Maybe there probably are some in the FBI archives, but that'd be on paper. There's no way to actually get that electronically. And the historian didn't know about that. Some of the locals didn't know about that. So what do you make of that? That's an odd verification that we have to kind of put in as part of the evidence.
That's the sort of thing that most skeptics or debunkers would class as anecdotal, that can't be taken seriously because it can't be confirmed.
Yeah, people toss around, including the TV ghost hunters, toss around the term anecdotal evidence, their phrase, like it's worthless. But the fact is, we would not be investigating anything, even on any psychological experience at all, is all anecdotal, right? Any subjective experience that somebody tells you about is anecdotal. So there is no social science without anecdotal evidence.
I would think there'd be regular science too. I mean, it's how they discovered meteors, that people said there were rocks falling from the sky. And
that's correct. Or gorillas for that. Yeah. And rocks falling from the sky, gorillas in the jungle. And it started out at anecdotal evidence until this is the problem, is that, you have these physical things happening that are witnessed by lots of people. Maybe not the gorillas witnessed by a lot of people, but certainly meteorites witnessed by lots of folks. And to not look into them, which is what happened, is ridiculous. When the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in the early 1900s, there were reporters there. But scientists around the world were saying for weeks later that that's not possible. Powered flight was not possible.
And did they say that they were making it up?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah.
I find that a lot of scoffers are very quick to derogatively compare anomalous experiences to the likes of Bigfoot encounters and UFO abductions and things like that.
Yeah.
What do you think to that comparison?
There are so many varied types of human experiences. The only comparison is it's an experience. It's something that somebody did witness or had an experience, a subjective experience. But you can't compare these things at all. They're not the same at all. And even all reported psychic experiences are not necessarily the same, because people do make mistakes. There are misperceptions. People do come to wrong conclusions, which is why we have to ask questions, why we look into these things. And the scoffers, and the problem I've got really with the true disbelievers, with those pseudo skeptics, is not even that they don't believe it. I'm fine if they don't want to think that it's possible. It's how they behave around that. It's how they attack people. It's how they laugh at people. It's how they are arrogant about their belief. They're so certain that this is not possible, that you must be crazy or stupid. And they do their best to make people feel stupid. And that is as far from skepticism as possible. And it's far from being scientific as possible. I mean, it's just really, to me, it's idiotic. I mean, I had a friend of mine, one of the first skeptics I got to know really well, besides my uncle Herb, who was a radio newscaster in New York, was very skeptical about all this. So I kind of grew up with a skeptic. So it was not, but he was he was not a scoffer per se. He just would say, something like that. Bob Steiner, Robert Steiner, who's no longer with us, was one of the founders of the Bay Area Skeptics. He was a magician. That's how I got to know him, as a magician. He was actually at one point a president of the Society of American Magicians. And Bob told me he went through a process where he completely disbelieved in all this stuff and thought that everybody who claimed to be a psychic was a fraud and they were lying and all of that. And he got to learn from, he met people, he talked to people who had experiences, he spent time talking to some of the psychics. He was well versed in cold reading and other techniques of being a fraudulent psychic. And he came to the conclusion that there were an awful lot of people who were very sincere but wrong. Even people who call themselves psychics. He's the one who actually pointed me at people who may have been incredibly observant and intuitive, and their family or friends told them they must be psychic, they should be a psychic. So sometimes the environment convinces you that you are psychic, even though you're not. Doesn't mean they're not useful or coming up with good information. It's just that it's not psychic. And I think Bob was close. He was still a little off to the disbeliever side, but he was always willing to look at evidence, always willing to talk about things. I even got referred to him first by John Palmer, who was the parapsychologist, was the chair of our parapsychology program. He had gotten to know Bob as well. So while Bob was not interested in really delving deeply into the research, he did not dismiss things right off the bat. Certainly not as fraudulent or people as crazy at all. I mean, he didn't think that was the case. Although, as we know, there are people who have psychological issues that can present themselves as being psychic.
Now, when you do an investigation, how do you tell the difference? What are between, is a medium genuine? Are people reporting genuine PK, which is, a mind's ability to move objects, versus either making it up or hallucinating? How do you tell the difference?
Well, I've had over the years, especially in our graduate parapsychology program, we had a number of people who were psychics, even a couple of mediums who said that they wanted to work with us, and we would check them out. I'd have them do readings for us, or take them on. Sometimes I would take them on a case. First, I would have a long conversation with them, honestly, because there are personality issues that would make me not work with even the best actual psychic. If you're working with them on an investigation, or if you want to work with them in person, or if you want to recommend them as somebody for a reading, there's a level of humanity that has to be present in them for us to work with them. For me personally, work with somebody in research or an investigation, they have to be willing to be questioned. They have to be secure enough in themselves that if I ask them, are you sure you got that? That they don't suddenly get defensive. So that process is part of my process of determining if somebody is psychic or not, or I'm going to work with them, or if I'm going to recommend them. And same thing goes, with mediums, certainly. Then I, have to look and see the kind of information that they get and what they can actually do. Now, when somebody tells me that they had an experience, you really can't go back on one experience and delve into it too deeply, because we were not at the location. So someone says, I can move objects. I have people who do contact me and say, I want you to research with me because I can, bend things without actually touching them, bend spoons. I had a guy years ago, and I have a photograph somewhere of a guy who claimed he was able to not just do spoon bending, but he actually was able to take a wooden pencil and twist it into a knot. And I have a photo of what looks like a wooden pencil twisted into a knot from him. He's too far away for me to do actual research with. He had a great sense of humor about the whole thing. I would have loved to, the guy's, I believe he's passed away now, but I would have loved to actually have done research with this guy, because he might have had something genuine, but he would have had to show it to me in a living context. We do try to look for alternative explanations when we're doing cases with physical activity. We're always looking for alternatives. We're always looking, and I have had a couple of cases where one family member was faking out the others. So we have to look at those kinds of things when it comes to PK stuff. It's not a simple, there's not a tell necessarily. Although I will say that when I get calls from people who want an investigation and the case might sound really good, and then I ask them, what do you want out of it? Do you want it to stop? Do you want understanding? What do you want? When I hear, well, we think we can probably sell this as a TV movie, we can write a book about it, we can put it on if it's that kind of thing, and it's if it's a restaurant or bar that's a business that has something to promote, I might consider it. But when it's a private, residence or something like that, there's something wrong here. That's a red flag, and it's been a red flag for some of my colleagues. My buddy Pete Haviland, who unfortunately passed away earlier this month actually, in Texas. Pete, for a while, he was not a parapsychologist per se, but he was an incredibly knowledgeable investigator, and we talked quite often. And he, for a while, when he was starting out, he joined the TAPS, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, the guys from Ghost Hunters. He joined their network to get case referrals. That's the only reason he did it. He ended up stopping after a few years because 50% of the cases that got referred to him in Texas, he and his people would show up at this house. It sounded great on the phone. They'd show up there, and the people would get angry sometimes, not always angry, but really annoyed that the TV crews weren't there with them. They thought if they were calling TAPS, they'd get the ghost hunter guys showing up with TV. So in all of those cases, Pete said that they turned around and left. And those might have been legitimate cases. He felt bad about the ones, but you can't really deal with people that way. And you can't go past the idea that at least some of this is going to be exaggerated if they want to be on TV, if that's their reasoning.
I suppose, what do you do when you're approached with questions regarding genuine mediums and genuine psi practitioners, I suppose, when you're approached with a question of, well, if they were genuine, they would have A, won the Randy Challenge, B, won all the lotteries, C, warned everybody about upcoming earthquakes or terrorist attacks, things like that.
Well, first, let's go to the second two first. They're not all precognitive. I know that people love to go to psychics to get their future, but the majority of psychics are not necessarily good about the future. And in fact, the really good psychics will tell you, and I'm going to paraphrase one of the psychics I worked with back years ago. She would tell people right up front, because they're coming about their future, she would say, effectively, the future can change. If I give you information about what's going to happen in 2 weeks or next week, the information I give you, you may make different decisions. You're going to possibly act on this information, even unconsciously. So now if you come back to me next week and tell me it didn't happen, I'll tell you that it didn't happen because you did X, Y, and Z. So the better psychics believe that the future is not predetermined. Not all of them are connected to the earth. Not all of them can predict weather. Not all of them. I mean, let's face it, there is a physical science that is designed or dedicated to predicting the weather. You can get a PhD in meteorology and you can't predict the damn weather more than a couple of hours out, because there are so many things in play around the world. And the same thing happens when you predict something for a human being. There's so many things in play. For a horse race, so many things in play. Jockeys and horses, the racetrack. Lottery, most psychics are not terribly good with numbers. They're more kind of right brain visual in some ways. That's why associative remote viewing might work, but picking numbers doesn't necessarily work. All right, so there's the future piece. And I usually tell people, if you're trying to find out about your future, find out what's going on with you now that'll help you make decisions for the future, which is what Kathy Reardon, the psychic, would tell them. What I tell you now is what I see is looking towards what's going on for you. Use this information in a positive way for yourself. All right, as far as the Randy Challenge goes, there are a lot of layers to this, and it had changed over the years. Of course, now, it hasn't been in operation since 2015, so there is no Randy Challenge anymore anyway. Initially, when I and others first read the rules and the application process, they were enough to cause people not to do the challenge. First of all, unless Randy took a personal interest in it right up front, you had to first be tested by a local group. And that test was likely not to be fair. It was not being overseen by Randy or his people. A lot of the local skeptic groups are not skeptics, they're pseudo skeptics. And you have to pass their test first to get on to the Randy Challenge. That's number one. So there's a lot of effort involved. That's that one piece of it. The other end of things, no matter how fair the testing that Randy was going to be, if you read the rules, if you won the $1 million or lost, either way, Randy owns the results. Everything has to be if you win the $1 million, everything had to pretty much go through through Randy himself or his people. He could claim that you scammed them, that you conned them, that you faked the whole thing, beat our controls. Somehow you did it. You're still a fraud. You have $1 million, but you're still a fraud. So your reputation is useless at that point. There are so many other levels that effectively Randy owned you. And if the million was enough for you, that's great. But there were a couple of my colleagues actually sat in. One, my colleague Julian Isaacs years ago sat in on one of the tests of a young girl who was doing PK. And granted, you want to, as a researcher, you want to see what they can do, and then you want to start applying controls depending on what they can do. I mean, that's very fair, and that may be a multi-hour process, by the way, to do that. So that's what Randy did, and then they came to an agreement. Everybody came to an agreement. This is a good test. This is well controlled. And Randy said, "Okay, now we're going to do the test." And this girl had been sitting there doing this for hours. She was really exhausted. Julian said, "She needs to rest." No, we'll have to redo the whole control thing all over again. She has to do it now. So she failed. So there's a human performance issue here. And if you're made to do things over and over and over again till there's a point of exhaustion, you need to, if you don't have time to reset because they're afraid that suddenly you'll come up with another way to beat the controls in that couple of hours that you might have, there's a significant issue there. Clearly, that's a problem. The other thing, honestly, I talked to Annette Martin. I talked to other psychics about that. Annette was not a millionaire, but Annette did well for herself as a psychic, and she and her husband actually had one of the first CD, if you remember CDs, CD online shops out there before Amazon sold CDs, and they sold that to another company for a pretty penny. And she also there was a family couple of hardware stores that she was involved in. So when I asked her about that, she said, "I don't need the $1 million. I don't need that grief for $1 million. It's too much grief." And so many others that I've talked to said the same thing. It's like, why would I ever want to subject myself to that man and to his people? Now, of course, there were people for a long time who thought that there wasn't even $1 million. There really was. Some other people put that money up. And there were a lot of folks who didn't think that the test was going to be fair. So they didn't even try because of that.
I remember hearing, I believe on a podcast or reading, one example of someone who went through the test, and it just seemed, it was actually, I wish I could remember the name of it, but it was Skeptics. It's a skeptical podcast because I always listen to both sides. And to me, I thought she'd passed, and they were trying to say all the ways she hadn't. And essentially it was doing like, I believe like a medical prediction, and she'd gotten it right significantly beyond the odds of chance, like new things she could not have known. I wish I remembered about like 3 people, and then she got one wrong, and they were like, "See, she doesn't have these abilities."
Yeah, that was the thing, is that it seemed like there was a moving target as to what the actual result, the agreement as to what a success was.
Was that the
And sometimes
Russian
that moving
girl?
target happened during the test or even after the test. Yeah, there were a few other people who also did really what we would consider strong significance. I think there was an astrologer who did something who had incredibly, good significance. There were several other people. Randy had a TV special years ago, and they had a dowser. If I recall this, I have to look at that. I have it on tape somewhere. I'm trying to convert all my tapes right now to digital, but they had barrels full of dirt and one with water. And as I recall, the dowser found the water, but missed one. Actually said this one maybe is water too, but they didn't tell him how many water barrels there were. He did find water, but one of the other barrels he found was dirt. And so that it completely invalidated the test as far as they were concerned. That was not $1 million challenge. It was just for a TV show.
Yeah, it seems like that they have to prove it 100% of the time, which I don't think that would be possible.
That's not humanly possible for anything. A baseball player can't hit, a home run you might do it 1 out of 2 times, but you can't do it 2 out of 2 times. And partly that's because every pitch is different. The conditions are different. There's so many variables involved. And with human beings, the performance, I mean, I don't know any psychologist who would expect in a psychology experiment anyone to do the same thing every single time the same way, unless maybe they had OCD.
I mean, this is why, statistical analysis is so important, because you don't need 100% success rate. You just need a certain level beyond reasonable assumption of chance.
Yeah, if we applied that to physics, then the CERN Super Collider is a significant disappointment since, even if they find the particle once and they declare it's real, how many billions of times did they look for it? In fact, in Discover magazine back in the 80s, when the article that came out, short article about Project Alpha, where Randy had sent in a couple of magicians into a lab to try to fool the parapsychologists, and they really weren't fooled at the very end of things, because they hadn't found under control conditions these guys couldn't do anything. But that's not how it was presented to the public. But there was an article on the same page about having found a new, I think it was a new muon, using a bubble cloud chamber in physics, and you predict the pathway of particle collisions in a bubble cloud chamber and try to match them to your mathematical prediction, saying that here's the particle. So it was something like 3 bubble cloud chamber photos out of a couple of billion, and they declared that the particle is real. So in physics that makes sense, but you could, if that was if that's what you applied to human beings, all bets were off on everything.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. And I suppose to give Randy his dues, he did certainly do a lot of good at showing many frauds, to the public.
I think that, I think Randy, I am the first to admit that Randy did an amazing job on uncovering the phony faith healers. He did a lot with that aspect of things, and yes, he did uncover phony. I've uncovered phony psychics as well. It's just that his attitude and the way he presented it often, that's why I think that documentary was called An Honest Liar. I would say a lying liar, like Al Franken would say, because there wasn't a whole lot to this subject that was honest about him. I had my own run-ins with him. He never corrected himself. So, for example, there was an article that the Daily Grail, Greg Taylor wrote, a lengthy article looking at the $1 Million Challenge a number of years ago. And the first quote in the article is from me, but there are many quotes from other people throughout the article. And Randy, when he posted it on his forum, and it's still up there in the blog that he had, he made it look like, when he wrote it, I don't think Greg Taylor's name was even mentioned. Apparently, I wrote the article, and all the quotes were from me. And he took pot shots at me. So Greg Taylor immediately let me know that. I looked at it. Greg actually sent a note to Randy and to the moderator and editor of the forum, and the guy apparently talked to Randy, and Randy refused to change it. So the moderator or the editor had to put a little message at the top, just a little thing that if you didn't notice the beginning indicator that this is not about Loyd Auerbach, you would think that it was still me. So stuff like that. Why not? Why not fix it? Why not change it? A friend of mine who's got a really cool podcast called The Edge of Reality, Lee Spiegel. Lee also has worked for the Huffington Post. He had a radio show on NBC Radio, NBC AM in New York back in the late 70s into the 80s. And I did a number of his shows. We became good friends. And Lee did a review of Flim Flam, I believe it was, and found a huge number of inaccuracies, incorrect statements that were easily checked. So it was not an accurate book. And when this was presented to Randy, and this has happened multiple times, magicians who found errors in his history of conjuring, he said the same kind of thing. His researchers made those mistakes. He didn't. And yet his name is on the book as the author. That total liability for it. So if you're not willing to take credit or blame for mistakes that are made by other people because they're working for you, that means you're not checking their work. And what does that say about you?
And not retracting if you're wrong. That's really the thing. If you're wrong,
change it.
You publicly retract if your goal really is to get to the truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's pretty clear that, and this is the case with a lot, James Alcock, who wrote that article where he said he never really looked at the evidence. He wrote a book years ago on parapsychology. So at least he looked at something way back when. But he certainly may not have looked at any research in recent times at all. And of course, the hue and cry against the journal that actually published Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future Precognition study. When it was announced, the contents for the upcoming journal were announced, just the fact that all these mainstream scientists who were disbelieving, pseudo skeptics, and skeptics were consistently trashing the journal, calling for the journal to retract the article, to not publish it. There were just so many things wrong. And reporters would sometimes ask those mainstream scientists, some of them were big names, have you read the article, the paper? No. Why would I? ESP is impossible.
I remember reading something. It was a skeptical article, and it was actually knocking the Rhine. And I'd love you to mention the Rhine too. And they were mentioning going to an event, and there was spoon bending there. And basically, they said, obviously, we all know spoon bending is impossible. We didn't try it, but. And I was like, you don't get more skeptical, especially than I was in the beginning. And I tried it, and I did it one time. I didn't do it the next time, but then I watched people bend the same spoons I couldn't, all women about the same size. And it's just like, I think that was such a revelation for me, was how all these people would say, this doesn't happen, this isn't possible, I never read it, but I never tried it, but. And I'm just like, that doesn't apply for anything. Like, anything in life. You really, if you're going to take the time to have a strong opinion, at least try it. Otherwise, you could say, I don't really believe it, I'm not that interested. But if you are taking the time to make a point, and I don't know, I've wondered this, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, is a lot, as you define the pseudo skeptics, a lot seem like they come from fundamentalist religious backgrounds where they've been fed.
Yes. Yeah.
And not to knock religion, I mean, I know some can be really wonderful, but nevertheless, they've been fed a very kind of pseudoscientific life that, with the worst of religion, the worst of fundamentalists and limitations. So they have a none of this could be true, like sort of maybe an anger to that, and yeah, that's something interesting I've noticed is almost every single one seems to have come from a fundamentalist religious background.
Well, except that most of them are today, many of them are atheists.
But they were raised fundamentalist religion.
They may have been raised in religion, yeah. You know, people react differently when they get out of those fundamental, um, those kind of rigid religious traditions. Sometimes they become agnostics for religion. Sometimes, or they don't care. Sometimes they change to a different religion that's a lot less rigid. And sometimes they go to some form of atheism, which can be incredibly rigid. We see some people like Richard Dawkins, who calls himself a militant atheist, to the point where, I mean, he is so dismissive of the people who have religious beliefs that one of the major atheist organizations have kind of disowned him. So there's a spectrum of belief and disbelief in the divine and God and a higher power or whatever else. And even to me, if you spend time talking to people and meeting and discussing the lack of a God, and if you're talking about God in a negative context, you're still doing religious discussion. So you're still behaving in a religious context in that way. If you simply don't talk about it or don't care, that's fine.
Yeah. And it marks a difference between atheism in terms of the disbelief or the lack of belief in a God versus an atheist movement, which becomes political.
Correct.
As far as I can see. And when it becomes a political movement, it's indistinguishable, apart from the existence of a deity, it's indistinguishable from any other religious or any religious movement itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, the Skeptical Inquirer years ago started doing ads where, asking people to remember PsyCop in their wills, in their bequests, which is something that churches have been doing for hundreds of years. Some of the tactics, some of the what they've done in their magazine. It's not a journal; it's a magazine, and online and other things. It's good fundraising, but it mimics what a lot of religious organizations do. I guess you see a good idea, so you take it on. So, but it's the behavior is rigid. It is again the problem. I don't have a problem with rigid thinking or disbelief. I don't even have a problem if somebody says, "Why would I?" Something like that. But to be arrogant, to react to somebody who has an experience, and say, "Oh, you're totally, you're lying. You're gullible. You're crazy. It's all woo woo, or just woo as they're using it now." If you even have an interest in it, that's a real problem. Years ago, we heard about this at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, that Brian Josephson, who is a Nobel Prize winning physicist for the superconducting circuit, he's expressed interest in consciousness and even parapsychology over the years. And we heard at the lab, one of the physicists told us this, that he was uninvited to a physics conference in England. He was told not to come because of his interest in consciousness and psi. And the second part of that was a few days later, he was re-invited because many of the people who were registered who were planning on attending were then saying, we're not coming if he's not coming because of this. That's like saying, if anybody's coming who happens to also be religious to a physics, you can't come.
It's a form of I was going to say it's a form of prejudice.
It's totally a form of prejudice. Yeah, it's academic prejudice, and frankly, in the UK, I think it's a little bit more open to consciousness and psi than it is here in the States because psychop had such a direct influence on academics. There are people who can't even express their interest in the subject within their department for fear of ridicule or even problems with the university. I knew someone who was an adjunct professor at the University of Florida who was fired because of his outside interest in parapsychology and doing investigations. And he had a letter to prove it. And I tried very hard to convince him to sue the university because he actually I showed a couple of attorneys. He would have had no problem winning that case. The problem is that his wife had a really good job in administration and they didn't fire her. And there would have been retaliation. And while they were doing the case, she would have been fired and then they would have had no income. So he decided not to do it.
First of all, that's so maddening because truly a scientist or, skeptic is curious about all research, and they seem to conflate data in parapsychological research with, religion or spirituality. I mean, and not that there's anything wrong with religion or spirituality when, as long as it's not passing laws or, but they seem to conflate the two when one is very much data and science, and they're very different to me.
Well, the problem is the people on the other side also conflate it with religion and spirituality. I did an Oprah Winfrey show years ago, centered on a case that was in a book called The Black Hope Horror. Was a neighborhood in Texas where it was like the Poltergeist movie. This couple was having a swimming pool dug and bodies fell out. And that's because it turned out the developer put the development on top of a potter's field, didn't move the bodies. So the couple actually ended up finding other neighbors and suing the developer, and it made the news as the Poltergeist case. Not too long after that, apparently a writer started canvassing the neighborhood looking for anybody who might be willing to talk about their negative experiences of this, because clearly this would generate something like in Poltergeist, and we could probably do an Amityville horror type book. So he found a couple who did that. Now, the first couple had a positive experience. They got a fund up and they paid for the reburial, the identification and reburial of the people in the potter's field. They had a positive experience with an apparition. Another neighbor had a positive experience. So almost all the neighbors had positive experiences. And that couple was also on the panel along with the couple who wrote the book with the author. So Paul Kurtz, who was big at Psychop, was with me, and he was shocked to find out that I was also incredibly skeptical of these people. We agreed on pretty much everything, but at one point the guy, when we were questioning the legitimacy, especially of some of the things they reported as being responsible from the ghosts, the negative spirits. They had 4 family members die after they moved off, after all this happened, 3 of whom did not die at the location, one of whom who died at the house, who had actually cancer, and she died of a heart attack. So the heart attack obviously was caused by a ghost. And we were questioning that, and the guy said, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in ghosts. It's like, what do the two things have to do? And I've heard that before. People do conflate these two things, and whether they're believers or frauds. And I do have to say also, Liz, that it's not just a religious reaction or an anti-religious reaction that some of the pseudo skeptics have. Sometimes, and I've met people who have been scammed by psychics, phony psychics, and they go the other direction, or they knew someone who was scammed by a phony psychic.
That makes sense.
So that is enough to cause that kind of instant reaction and lump them all together as well.
That makes sense too. Okay, so it's almost an hour and a half. I don't want to keep you too long, Loyd. So maybe Darren and I can each finish up with one more question, because I could keep talking about this all night. I assume you have other things to do.
Oh, I could, yeah.
I guess, Darren, do you want to go with your last question?
I suppose a good question to ask would be, do you think that the legitimate science of paranormal investigation has been, I suppose, tarnished by the more entertainment-based ghost hunting shows and YouTube channels and things like that? And which would you consider to be the more legitimate than others?
Well, I don't think any of the shows are legitimate at all. I mean, they're run by producers and editors. They're not legit at all. And the methods that they're using are based on the needs of television, not based on the needs of science. And unfortunately, too many of the ghost hunters out there and paranormal investigators are following these methods, which are flawed to begin with. So they may have a genuine interest in, unfortunately, not everyone who calls himself a ghost hunter actually is interested in doing anything more than getting that EVP that excites them or having an experience. They're not really interested in why or what's happening. They're really not. But there's a large percentage who are. It's just that they're starting from a perspective or a place that is flawed. Now, on the positive side, the shows have brought people out of the woodwork with their interest, which is good. Some of those people then learn that there's another way to do things, and they'll take courses or start reading books in parapsychology, also positive. Interestingly enough, I don't see too much from the skeptics, the pseudo skeptics, or skeptics in general, that compares parapsychology to what's on TV, to those ghost hunting shows. I don't see too much of that. I have been cast in that role by Randy, in fact, even though he knew damn well that, in fact, people knew he knew that wasn't true. And after he posted something about me, after I had done him a favor, it was the weirdest thing in the world. I was told not to respond to him, and some of my skeptic buddies did and basically dealt with it. So, you have a separation in that way, which is good. And I think it's because we're a lot more careful, although because of the way when I do a TV show, it can be edited in such a way that it makes me look like I'm doing something like the ghost hunters are doing, even though I'm not really doing that. And I have to explain that, which is fine. What's happened, however, is it's pushed all these people who have an interest in the subject away from parapsychology, because the main show, Ghost Hunters, and the secondary main show, Ghost Adventures, have nothing to do with parapsychologists at all. I mean, Barry Taft's been on Ghost Adventures a couple of times. I even did Ghost Adventures as a favor to a friend of mine on the show, who worked on the show. Just a quick intro to the USS Hornet. That's as far as I've gotten for that. But unfortunately, there's a mobilization of all these people that could be very helpful to parapsychology if, in fact, they actually spent a little time learning about not only the real thing to do, but also how to communicate that within the field. Most of my colleagues do not watch those shows. Some of them don't even watch much TV. They're in that academic world where they may not even have a TV, which I can't even imagine these days. But I've been told when I've mentioned some of the shows or some of the stuff to some of my colleagues, they were totally unaware, which is oblivious to everything, which is also an indication that the skeptics are not connecting to parapsychology.
What would you say would be the strongest evidence that should give someone hope this is really true, that there is afterlife and something more than just consciousness by a brain?
I don't think there's one piece of evidence. I think it's the preponderance of evidence from a variety of types of experiences. I really suggest people look at especially Jeffrey Mishlov's Bigelow Prize winning essay, which is fairly lengthy only because he has embedded links and videos in it throughout, which has kind of made a shorter document significantly longer. So it may look like it's a really long document. It's really not as long as it looks. If you folks just simply go to BICS, BICS, I think it's BICS.org. It's the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. If they go there and look at the winning essays, at least a few of them, Mishlov's and a couple of the others by folks in the field, you'll get a feel for the kinds of evidence there is. The other side of that is personal. It's a personal thing. People who have an experience with an apparition at the time of that person's death or right after. That's very convincing. People who have longer term apparitional experiences, that's very convincing. People who have a near death experience, that's convincing to them. So it just really, it can come at it from two different angles. But what it boils down to is we still don't know what the afterlife is like, but we do have enough evidence to indicate that consciousness can exist without the body, can survive on its own afterwards. Unless you're a materialist, in which case none of this counts.
I'm going to add also take classes at the Rhine with Loyd. That made a big difference for me early on to see this taught in a logical, intelligent way, which I wasn't expecting. So yeah, that really helped me.
Yeah, and speaking of which, coming up in February, next course I'll be teaching, we'll be looking at some key cases of apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists in the past. A number of mine, but also some of my colleagues as well. So kind of an in-depth look at some of these cases that most of which suggests some idea of consciousness after death. And then there'll be our course on the evidence for survival will be handled in the spring. And it's the Rhine Education Center. It's Rhine, RHINE.edu.org.
This is the end of my conversation with Darren McEnany and Loyd Auerbach. To follow Darren, go to his website, seeking-i.com, which also links to all of his other channels. To follow Loyd, he has many links and social media and places to buy his books. I'll link to them in the show notes, but you can also Google Loyd with one L, Auerbach, Auerbach, to get more information on what the fuck just happened, to get updates on when the book launches, download Grief Bingo, and more. Go to WTFJustHappened.net, check us out, and subscribe to our newsletter. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if you've had any crazy what the fucks yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hi, reach out either on Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?